Some news is simply too difficult to absorb all at once. I don't know the science behind it, but I know that there is an innate internal mechanism that keeps us from being destroyed by horrible news. A shield of sorts that disperses the damage of a head-on collision with hardship. Many years ago, our best friends grieved the death of their only child while she was but a toddler. The first days after her death were consumed with funeral plans and notifying friends and remembering to eat. There was no denying the fact of their loss, but they managed, somehow, to put one foot in front of the other. And they did that for a long time. But each day, each week, each month brought deeper realization of what they had lost, their grief leaking only slowly into their lives. So slowly that more than a year after their daughter's death, they looked at one another across the supper table and simultaneously began to sob. A year's worth of anguish about the past that they had endured and the future they would never have flooded out on the table between them. Now, as they look back on that time 30 years ago, they realize that it took that long for their hearts and their heads to fully receive the truth. I don't know that I would have survived the blow if it had fallen all at once, my friend now recalls. I think God sheltered us until we were strong enough to receive it all. If there is something in us that protects us from receiving sorrow all at once, might the same be true of joy? Scripture tells us very different stories about the immediate aftermath of the resurrection. What did the resurrected Jesus look like? What did he say? Who saw him? What did he do? The most outrageous claim of all comes from the Apostle Paul, who in 1 Corinthians 15 asserts that Jesus made numerous appearances after the resurrection, including a selfie with more than 500 people at the same time. We, with 2,000 years of hindsight, are able to see clearly that the empty tomb meant Jesus had been raised, just as he said. But that was not so clear that first Easter day. What prevented those witnesses from believing, some of whom had been his dearest friends? Was it that innate protective impulse that shielded them from crushing fear? Maybe he was dead and it had all been a lie? Or was the news too good to be true, the joy too immense to absorb all at once? This morning's gospel leaves the answer to that question open. I love this story of the Emmaus Road. Two men who had been part of Jesus' inner circle were trudging heads down, one foot in front of the other, from Jerusalem to Emmaus for supper. Apparently, word of the empty tomb had spread quickly through the city, so when a stranger, whom we know to be Jesus, appeared beside them, they were stunned that he hadn't heard. Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what happened? Of course, Jesus knew what had happened. It had happened to him. Why didn't he let on? Why did he leave them dangling? And why, if they had been part of his entourage, did they not recognize him? Maybe they were struggling to absorb the enormity of their loss. Or maybe their hearts could not absorb the possibility that Jesus was very much alive after having been very much dead. Jesus berated them for being dolts and went on at great length about scriptural evidence of the promised Messiah's true identity. So let's see. 7 miles at an average walking pace of 3 miles an hour means that Jesus held him captive for 2 hours, maybe more. And still, in spite of Jesus' extensive biblical knowledge, the familiarity of his face and his voice, the extended time they spent with him, they regarded their companion as little more than a smart stranger. "Stay with us," they offered when they reached the exit for Emmaus. They invited him to stay, not because it might be Jesus, but because that road got very dangerous after dark, and this man had no business being out there by himself. And it was then, finally, seated at table in the descending dark, that the light began to dawn. They asked Jesus to offer the blessing, as was customary with a guest at your table. He offered the prayer. He broke the bread. Crumbs fell, eyes opened, and Jesus disappeared. It was him. It was him, grabbing a to-go cup and a flashlight. They ran all the way back to Jerusalem in the middle of the night. Luke writes, "Then they told what had happened on the road and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread." When sorrow is too intense or joy too tempting, Jesus can still be seen in the breaking of the bread. Our sister Ava receives her first communion today wearing a stunningly beautiful dress. It is a day for which she and her family have studied and prayed and practiced for quite a while. What will this be like for you? The first time she holds Jesus in her hands, the first time she receives him in a cup. Will you see Jesus? Or, as with generations of disciples before, will he be elusive, perhaps even invisible? I remember my first communion 1,000 years ago. Dinosaurs walked the earth. It was back in the wafer days. Remember the wafer days? And my biggest fear was dropping the wafer on the floor. Instead, it stuck to the roof of my mouth. Or dribbling wine down the front of my brand new white dress. I don't remember seeing Jesus that day. I don't remember much about that day. But fortunately, I have been offered Jesus' body and blood countless times since then. I was not doomed to the fear and clumsiness of that first time. And in this meal, in many ways and in many places, Jesus has come near to me and opened my eyes. But it takes time to recognize Jesus in our midst. If his own disciples couldn't see him clearly, we can be patient with ourselves when his presence is hard to discern. But Ava, it will come. Jesus will become real to you in unexpected ways, in places other than this, and at wonderful different times in your life. Sometimes Jesus appears to us when we are forgiven, when we don't deserve to be forgiven. Sometimes Jesus appears in a peace that washes over us for no explicable reason in the midst of terrible trouble. Sometimes Jesus appears in places like this, looking oddly like people that we know, who love you, who share a common purpose. And sometimes it takes a while. Trouble will come. Trouble comes to us all. So where is Jesus then, as the darkness settles on our hearts? I believe Jesus is at work even in troubled times, protecting us from the full force of the blow, guiding us down a gentler, safer path. But joy will also come. Joy so intense you won't be able to hold it all at once. And Jesus is in that joy, expanding our capacity a little at a time until our hearts grow large enough to hold it. Some news is too difficult to absorb all at once. So whether it is joy or sorrow, God meets it out to us a little at a time. A scrap of bread, a sip of wine, a hug of peace, a song that gives voice to words that we didn't know. And though the travelers to Emmaus begged Jesus to stay with them, it is Jesus who urges us to stay with him in tremendous sorrow, in enormous joy, until we are able to see him in the breaking of the bread.